The house felt larger at night, as if the walls stretched when the lights went out. Ethan Walker lay on his bed staring at the faint glow of his phone screen, listening to the low hum of the air conditioner and the occasional creak of old wood settling. His parents were away for the weekend, the kind of quiet absence that should have felt freeing. Instead, it pressed on him, heavy and unresolved, like a question he had been avoiding for too long that he turned the phone face down and closed his eyes. Sleep didn't come easily anymore. It hadn't since Megan started talking about the future with a certainty that made his chest tighten. She was kind, patient, and deeply invested in them, and that was the problem. Ethan cared for her, truly, but lately their conversations felt rehearsed, as if he were playing a role he had once agreed to without fully understanding the script. Earlier that evening, Megan had called him from her apartment. Her voice had been warm, familiar, and distant all at once. She talked about plans, trips they could take, changes they could make, the way things would look a year from now. Ethan had listened, offering responses that sounded right, while a quiet part of him drifted elsewhere. When she asked if he was still there, he'd laughed softly and said yes, feeling the lie settle uncomfortably in his stomach. After the call ended, he sat in the dark longer than necessary, trying to trace when the space between them had grown so wide. It wasn't anger or betrayal that divided them, just a gradual thinning of connection. He didn't know how to explain that to her without sounding ungrateful, or worse, confused that a muted sound from down the hall pulled him back. Footsteps. Familiar ones. Lucas Walker moved through the house with an easy confidence, never trying to be quiet, never trying to be loud. Ethan could always tell it was him. They had lived under the same roof for 2 years now, ever since Ethan's father remarried, and still the presence of his stepbrother unsettled him in ways he hadn't learned to name. Lucas wasn't what Ethan had expected when they first met. He was older by a year, sharper around the edges, with an observant calm that made people talk more than they intended. He didn't overshare, but he noticed everything. The way Ethan avoided certain topics. The way he lingered at doorways as if deciding whether to enter or retreat. Lucas had a habit of holding eye contact a second longer than necessary, not aggressively, just long enough to make Ethan aware of himself. During dinner that night, Lucas had barely spoken. He'd pushed food around his plate, listening while Ethan filled the silence with small talk. Their parents had already left, suitcases loaded into the car, instructions given about trash days and locked doors. Once they were gone, the house shifted. Lucas leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, studying Ethan with a thoughtful expression that made him lose his train of thought mid-sentence. "What?" Ethan had asked, defensive without knowing why. "Nothing," Lucas replied, lips curving slightly. "You just seem tired." It was a simple observation, but it landed too close to the truth. Ethan shrugged it off, cleared the table, and retreated to his room sooner than usual. He told himself it was exhaustion, that everything felt heavier because he'd been overthinking again. That was his pattern, name the feeling something manageable and move on. Now, in the quiet, his thoughts circled back to Lucas despite his efforts. He remembered the first week they lived together, the awkward politeness, the careful boundaries. Over time, those boundaries had softened. Late-night conversations in the kitchen. Shared jokes that no one else heard. Moments when Lucas seemed to understand him without explanation, and that understanding frightened him. Ethan shifted onto his side, pulling the blanket higher. He tried to picture Megan's smile, the steadiness she offered, the life she imagined for them. It should have been enough. He wanted it to be enough. Instead, another image intruded, Lucas leaning against the doorway earlier that evening, arms folded, eyes unreadable, as if he had something to say and was deciding whether to say it. A floorboard creaked again, closer this time. Ethan's eyes opened. The sound stopped just outside his room. He held his breath, listening, suddenly aware of how thin the walls were, how exposed he felt. He told himself Lucas was just heading to the bathroom, or getting a glass of water. Normal things. Harmless things. Seconds passed. Nothing happened. Ethan exhaled slowly, tension loosening from his shoulders. He turned onto his back and stared at the ceiling, counting breaths, trying to let his mind settle. The quiet returned, but it no longer felt empty. It felt watchful. As his eyelids finally grew heavy, one thought lingered, uninvited and persistent: whatever was shifting inside him could no longer be ignored. The house was silent again, yet something had already begun, subtle and irreversible, waiting just beyond the closed door. Ethan woke to the soft click of his door, a sound so gentle it blended into the edges of his dream. For a moment, he wasn't sure if it was real. Then the air in the room shifted, as if someone else had brought their thoughts inside with them. He opened his eyes and saw Lucas standing just past the doorway, one hand still resting on the knob, his expression careful and undecided. "Sorry," Lucas said quietly. "I didn't mean to wake you." Ethan sat up, heart beating faster than the situation seemed to require. The room was dim, lit only by the streetlight slipping through the blinds. Lucas didn't move closer, but he didn't leave either. The space between them felt deliberate, charged with everything they had never said. "It's fine," Ethan replied, though his voice sounded unfamiliar to him. "What's up?" Lucas hesitated, eyes flicking briefly to the floor before returning to Ethan's face. "I couldn't sleep," he said. "I thought maybe you were still awake." The explanation was thin, but Ethan didn't challenge it. He nodded and shifted on the bed, making room without consciously deciding to. Lucas noticed, of course. He always noticed. He stepped inside and closed the door most of the way, leaving it slightly ajar, a narrow line of hallway light cutting across the carpet like a boundary neither of them named. They stood there in silence, the kind that demanded attention. Ethan became acutely aware of his own breathing, the way his hands rested against his thighs, the faint smell of detergent on his sheets. Lucas leaned back against the wall, arms crossed, gaze steady. "You've been distant," Lucas said at last. It wasn't an accusation, just a fact. Ethan gave a short laugh. "We live in the same house." "I don't think that's possible." "It is," Lucas replied. "You've been somewhere else." The words landed with uncomfortable precision. Ethan looked away, focusing on the shadow cast by the blinds. He thought of Megan's voice, her plans, the future she spoke about with certainty. He thought of how tired he felt pretending clarity he didn't possess. "I'm just dealing with stuff," he said. Lucas studied him for a moment, then uncrossed his arms. He took a step forward, stopping at the foot of the bed. The distance closed was small, but it changed everything. "You don't have to explain it to me," he said. "But don't act like I don't see it." Ethan swallowed. He wanted to push back, to reassert the rules he had been living by, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he found himself asking, "Why are you here, Lucas?" Lucas didn't answer right away. He glanced at the door, then back at Ethan. "Because I didn't want to keep pretending either," he said. "And because tonight felt like the wrong night to stay quiet." The honesty in his voice unsettled Ethan more than any confession could have. He felt exposed, as if Lucas had reached into the parts of him he kept guarded and named them without permission. He shifted again, resting his elbows on his knees. "This is a bad idea," Ethan said, though he didn't stand or ask Lucas to leave. "Maybe," Lucas agreed. "But ignoring it hasn't worked so far." They were close enough now that Ethan could see the faint crease between Lucas's brows, the tension he usually concealed so well. This wasn't confidence, it was vulnerability. That realization softened something in Ethan, something he had been bracing too tightly. "I have a girlfriend," Ethan said quietly. "I know," Lucas replied. "I'm not asking you to forget that." The restraint in Lucas's response made Ethan's chest ache. He realized, with a jolt of guilt, that this conversation itself was already a betrayal. Not of Megan alone, but of the version of himself that believed lines were clear and easy to maintain. Lucas sat down on the edge of the bed, leaving space between them. The mattress dipped slightly, grounding Ethan in the reality of the moment. "I just needed to be honest," Lucas continued. "With you. And with myself." Ethan closed his eyes briefly. He thought of all the times he'd chosen silence because it felt safer. He thought of how lonely that safety had become. When he opened his eyes again, Lucas was watching him, not expectant, just present. "I don't know what I'm doing," Ethan admitted. The words felt like a release. I don't know what any of this means. That's okay, Lucas said. You don't have to figure it out tonight. They sat there, the quiet no longer empty but full, layered with things unsaid yet understood. Ethan noticed how his tension eased, how the constant hum of uncertainty in his mind softened. He hadn't realized how much he needed to be seen without explanation. After a while, Lucas stood. I should go, he said, as if reminding them both of the world beyond the room. Ethan nodded, though something in him resisted the ending. Lucas moved toward the door, hand hovering over the knob. He paused, turning back. For what it's worth, Lucas said, you're not broken. You're just being honest later than you planned. The words stayed with Ethan as Lucas slipped out, leaving the door exactly as it had been before, slightly open, a thin line of light stretching across the floor. Ethan lay back against his pillows, staring at the ceiling again, but this time sleep didn't claim him. Instead, he lay awake, aware that a line had been crossed not by action, but by truth, and that whatever came next would demand more courage than silence ever had. Morning arrived with an uneasy clarity, as if the woods had sharpened every thought I was trying to avoid. Ethan moved through the routine of the campsite with practiced normalcy, greeting Daniel, accepting coffee from Mark, nodding at Lucas with a restraint that felt deliberate. The air between them was quiet but alert, charged by what had been left unsaid the night before. Ethan told himself that awareness did not equal intention, that noticing someone did not mean crossing a line. As the day progressed, opportunities for distance dissolved naturally. Daniel suggested splitting tasks again, and Mark volunteered to organize supplies near the car. Lucas and Ethan were left with the slow work of gathering firewood along the riverbank. The walk was unremarkable, yet every step felt measured. Neither spoke at first, as if language itself required permission. Lucas broke the silence by commenting on how different time felt out here, how days stretched without structure. Ethan agreed, admitting that the lack of noise made it harder to ignore his own thoughts. The admission surprised him. He rarely offered vulnerability so freely, yet with Lucas it emerged without resistance. Lucas listened, his attention complete, and that alone felt like intimacy. They sat on a fallen log to rest, the river moving steadily beside them. Lucas mentioned Mark again, this time with more hesitation. He spoke of routines that had become substitutions for conversation, of affection that remained intact but unexamined. Ethan did not encourage the confession, but he did not stop it either. He recognized the danger in that silence. Even as part of him leaned into it. Ethan responded by sharing his own pattern of emotional withdrawal, how he kept parts of himself contained to avoid disappointment. He spoke carefully, avoiding specifics, yet the truth was present beneath the restraint. Lucas acknowledged it with a quiet nod, as if recognizing a familiar shape. The moment lingered longer than necessary, their conversation suspended in something neither named. Back at the campsite, Mark noticed nothing unusual. He joked easily with Daniel, accepted the firewood, and thanked them both. Ethan watched the exchange with a growing sense of unease. Mark's trust felt undeserved, and that realization settled heavily in his chest. He began to understand that guilt did not require action, awareness alone was enough to fracture something essential. That afternoon, Daniel proposed a longer hike, eager to explore further trails. Mark agreed enthusiastically, but Lucas hesitated, citing fatigue. Ethan surprised himself by offering to stay back as well. The decision was framed as practical, almost casual, yet the implications were immediate. When Daniel and Mark disappeared down the path, the space they left behind felt suddenly vast. Lucas and Ethan sat near the fire pit, the remains of the morning's warmth still clinging to the stones. Conversation resumed slowly, circling safer topics at first. Lucas spoke about his career, the compromises he had made for stability. Ethan listened, sensing the careful balance Lucas maintained between responsibility and longing. When Lucas asked about Ethan's relationships, the question carried a weight that felt intentional. Ethan admitted he had never allowed himself to want too much from anyone. He spoke of endings that occurred before beginnings could take shape. Lucas responded with a softness that bordered on regret, saying that wanting did not always lead to loss, but avoiding it guaranteed emptiness. The words lodged themselves in Ethan's thoughts, unsettling and compelling. As the afternoon wore on, the conversation deepened without conscious decision. They spoke of fear, of the quiet disappointments that accumulate when needs remain unspoken. Each confession felt reciprocal, carefully balanced, as if they were negotiating an unspoken agreement. Ethan felt himself stepping closer to a boundary he had not known existed until now. When Lucas paused, his gaze fixed on the fire pit, Ethan sensed a shift. Lucas admitted that he felt more understood in those moments than he had in months. He clarified that he loved Mark, that commitment was not in question, yet something essential had been missing. Ethan's response came too quickly, offering reassurance he had no right to give. He realized then that he was no longer neutral. The sound of footsteps on gravel startled them both. Daniel and Mark returned earlier than expected, laughing about a wrong turn. Lucas leaned back, the moment dissolving instantly, but its residue remained. Ethan felt exposed, as if his thoughts had been briefly visible. He avoided Mark's eyes, suddenly aware of how fragile his composure had become. Dinner passed with polite conversation. Ethan contributed where expected, laughed when appropriate, but his attention kept drifting. Lucas was quieter now, more contained, yet his occasional glances carried a familiarity that felt earned too quickly. Ethan understood that something had shifted irreversibly, even if nothing tangible had occurred. That night, after Daniel retired, Mark joined Lucas briefly before heading to bed, tired from the hike. Lucas lingered again by the fire, though this time he did not invite Ethan explicitly. Ethan joined him anyway, drawn by an impulse he no longer attempted to justify. The night was cooler, the fire smaller, their voices subdued. Lucas spoke first, acknowledging the tension without naming it. He said he felt conflicted, aware that lines were blurring in ways that frightened him. Ethan admitted he felt the same, that the closeness had taken him by surprise. Neither suggested stepping away. Instead, they examined the feeling as if understanding it might contain it. Lucas confessed, almost reluctantly, that he thought about Ethan during moments he should have been fully present elsewhere. The admission was quiet, lacking drama, but its impact was immediate. Ethan felt the weight of the words settle between them, heavy and undeniable. He understood that this was the moment where restraint mattered most. Ethan did not reach out. He did not speak words of encouragement or rejection. He simply stayed, letting the confession exist without interruption. In that silence, something essential crossed from possibility into reality. Lucas exhaled slowly, as if relieved and burdened at once. The fire burned low, and neither moved to add wood. Ethan realized that by remaining, by allowing the confession to stand unchallenged, he had participated in something that could not be undone. As he finally stood to leave, the knowledge followed him like a shadow. An emotional line had been crossed, quietly and irrevocably, and the night closed around that truth, leaving him uncertain of what morning would demand.